Thank you, Gaurav. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're in. As Gaurav's mentioned, my name is Ed DeMursler. I'll be presenting today's webinar. Firstly, what I'd like to do before going into the main contents is to provide a bit of context on S/4HANA and then more specifically outline the key objectives of today's webinar. I mean, if you take a step back, with the announcement of S/4HANA in February of 2015, it's fair to say there's been an enormous amount of buzz generated within the market. And that's buzz generated by SAP, by partners like ourselves, by customers like yourselves. And the reality is, if you look at the messaging and to some extent the terminologies that have been used to date, at times it has been quite confusing and or inconsistent. And that's quite challenging for organizations like yourself who are established SAP users, because you really need to cut through all that buzz and make strategic decisions on how and when does S/4HANA fit within your overall strategic roadmap. And it is precisely for that reason why we've organized today's webinar. The objectives really are fourfold. The first one is it's an opportunity to give you an overview of S/4HANA, the platform, its benefits, and some of the roadmap of what's to come in the future. Understand the differences between S/4HANA and Suite on HANA, that there are a couple of options out there. But more importantly, it's to understand the key benefit drivers to help you build a compelling business case. I think we recognize this is the most challenging area for all established SAP organizations, is how do I come up with a compelling business case for S/4HANA, and is it even compelling to begin with? And fourth, last but not least, it's an opportunity for us to walk you through our Agile Benefits Creation, or ABC 123, for S/4HANA service offering, which is a mouthful, but it's primarily our methodology and our framework to help customers like yourselves on the journey to S/4HANA. The second thing I'd like to do before going into the main content of the webinar is just to spend a couple of minutes talking about who we are as HCL. HCL, we are a global IT services company. I think we have over 100,000 employees, but a large portion of our business comes from our SAP practice, which is where I'm from. We are a leading Tier 1 global SAP services partner. We have been for the last 18 plus years. We've got about 8,500 plus SAP professionals with deep product knowledge, not just within S/4HANA, but a variety of other SAP products across the landscape, as well as domain experience across numerous industries. Specifically in the context of S/4HANA, I'd like to draw your attention to 2 points. We are a global partner of SAP for S/4HANA as part of their go-to-market strategy. And secondly, we are also a release testing partner of SAP. So we help test the new releases of S/4HANA before they're actually distributed onto the market. And that's extremely valuable for us because it gives us two things. It gives us visibility and insight into the maturity of the S/4HANA product. Where does it do good? Where are some of the remaining gaps? But just as importantly, it also gives us insight into the future roadmap of the product itself. And we use that value to help inform customers in putting together their journey. So with that said, without further ado, the agenda for today's workshop, it is a fairly jam-packed workshop, quite a bit of content to go through. It's really 5 topics. The first is giving you an overview of S/4HANA. What is it precisely? How important is it to SAP? And what's the future roadmap for it? I'll then walk you through the key solution pillars. What are the key things that make S/4HANA so different to other platforms or to its predecessors, and what are the benefits of S/4HANA that we typically see? I'll then walk you through a few of the migration options. There are a few options available for organizations like yourself on your journey to S/4HANA. It isn't a one-size-fits-all, and quite frankly, depending on the organization and your circumstances, one option may be more favorable than others. I'll then walk you through what we see as HCL as the key value enablers for building your compelling business case. I'll identify some of the use cases we've seen elsewhere, as well as some of the pockets of a business process or IT that we would suggest you start looking at value creation. And then that will nicely tail off where I give you an overview of our ABC 123 for S/4HANA program. So how can we help established users like yourself on your journey? At the end, as Gaurav's mentioned, there'll be a Q&A session, which I'll attempt to answer your questions. Right, so S/4HANA, I mean, I think it's fair to say since its announcement in 2015, this is SAP's next big thing. In a nutshell, what is it? It is SAP's next generation business suite. I mean, it's intended to replace your current ERP6 solution, which has been around quite some time, since 2006. But really, it is fundamentally a new product. It's built entirely on SAP's in-memory platform, SAP HANA. It's available in two versions, which I'll talk about shortly, both on-premise as well as a cloud edition. But fundamentally, one of the things that sets it apart is it's built, as a result of it being built on the HANA platform, it's also got a fairly significantly simplified data model and simplified business processes, which make the overall processes simplified as well as the reporting. It's got a substantially different user experience paradigm, which not just makes the whole user experience improve, but also leads to some productivity benefits, which we'll talk about. It's fair to say SAP's de facto solution for any net new implementation is S/4HANA, unsurprisingly, given the scale of the time and effort and money spent on this new product. But nevertheless, SAP have also made it clear that they will continue to provide mainstream support for ERP6 until 2025. Nevertheless, they've also made it clear that they don't plan on making any major investments in the ERP6 platform in the future. So in a nutshell, from SAP's perspective, this is the most strategic development in their 40-year history. I think I've seen a quote somewhere that they will eventually need to develop 400 million lines of code as part of the S/4HANA product. So that in itself is an indication of how seriously SAP is taking this strategic bet. There's a few quotes out there. I've given you one from the chairman, Hasselplattner. I think it's fully recognized that this is the future for SAP, and it's pretty much a make or break decision. So I am sure you have seen the next slide time and time again presented by SAP, but nevertheless I think it's important to just spend a couple of minutes around what SAP's vision is for S/4HANA and the concept of this digital core, just so that we're all on the same page. If you take a step back, I think SAP's recognized that with the introduction of the whole digital era, organizations will fundamentally have to change the way they operate, the way they run processes, reports, interact with customers, interact with devices, with the Internet of Things, etc. And quite frankly, to enable organizations to cope with that new digital model, SAP see the absolute need for a core platform that will enable them to run those processes in the most efficient of manners, recognizing the digital challenges of the future. And that is precisely what S/4HANA is geared towards, based on SAP's vision. It is a core platform, which you can see here in the dark blue box on this page, which is primarily a core platform used to run the mission-critical business processes of any organization, whether that's procure to pay or finance or plan to product, retire to retire, etc. But it's fundamentally built with a set of line of business solutions which are designed and developed to meet the requirements of the digital era. And that's everything from being able to process large quantities of data on a real-time, on-the-fly basis, providing timely insight and action to businesses to help them on more effective decision-making. It's there to provide a simplified set of processes, a personalized user experience, connectivity with the Internet of Things, etc., etc. And really, this is where SAP sees S/4HANA functioning in the future. It does provide native connectivity with SAP's cloud-based LOB, line of business solutions like SuccessFactors. But one of the key things to recognize is that this is an evolving product. This is the first release of S/4HANA Enterprise, and there will be substantial future simplifications and innovations in the future. One of the areas that we will see, and I'll talk about it shortly, is SAP is very much focused on simplifying the core ERP platform, which is what you have today, ERP6. The intention is in the future it will eventually simplify the other business suite applications like SRM, CRM, as well as enterprise performance management systems like BW and BPC, will eventually be simplified and reintegrated back into the S/4HANA enterprise platform. And we are already seeing examples of this simplification of these other systems with the current version of S/4HANA Enterprise, which I'll talk about shortly, because these are one of the key benefit drivers of implementing S/4HANA. As mentioned, there are two versions of S/4HANA, which hopefully you're aware. There is an on-premise version, which is the version on the left-hand side of the screen, and then there is a cloud edition, which is the right-hand side of the screen. You know, it's fair to say, if you look at the amount of time, development effort, investment made by SAP, the majority of that has been made on the on-premise version, which is the version on the left. It's available, as the name mentions, it's available as on-premise or on a privately managed cloud. That could be managed by SAP or any partner, for that matter. It provides a full set of functionality, very, very similar to ERP. It supports 62 countries, 27 industries. There are some additional industries that are going to be rolled on to the S/4HANA Enterprise at the end of this year, but it is pretty much fully functional in terms of the core business processes. It's based on your fairly standard licensing model, which is named user base and a HANA database pricing. And this is the version that's got the substantial client base, which are the numbers that SAP are sending out and rapidly growing. On the flip side, you know, whilst this is where SAP's invested in the most, the reality is they do want to spend more time and effort developing the cloud edition. The cloud edition, it is a software as a service base, truly on a public multi-tenanted cloud, 100% managed by SAP on HEC, which is the HANA Enterprise Cloud. There are 3 editions available for it currently. One specific to marketing, one specific to project services, and another one is an Enterprise Edition ERP. Now the challenge with the Cloud Edition is that the functionality and the scope coverage is very, very limited, both in terms of country coverage as well as functionality or industry coverage. There is a roadmap. You know, there are definitely future roadmaps in place to further develop the Cloud Edition, but as it stands, it does not have the full breadth of functional or country or industry scope that large enterprises normally dictate. And for that reason, if you look at the number of customers on the Cloud Edition currently, we're not aware of any. I think we're aware of one that's in flight. But aside from that, it is very much lagging behind in maturity than the on-premise version. This is where the on-premise version is where majority of the effort is in terms of in-flight projects and live customers. So in terms of a selection criteria for your organization, really, it's going to come down to the breadth of the scope of your SAP landscape, the country scope, the industry scope. Typically, if your organization, a small to medium-sized enterprise, with a need for highly standardized ERP processes, then the Cloud Edition may very well be the right answer for you. But if you're a large enterprise with a fairly broad, complex SAP landscape spread across numerous countries and or processes and or industries, then as it stands, the on-premise version is the version for you. That's HCL's view. So that's a bit of an overview on S/4HANA and the roadmap itself. What I now really want to go to is a bit more detail around, you know, the key pillars, what are the key features of S/4HANA that make it different, and what are those benefits that we believe can be achieved by those pillars. So by and large, there are 4 solution pillars to S/4HANA, which is what we've outlined on this slide. I'll give a brief overview of each of them, but then I've got a more detailed slide on each of them to give you an appreciation of what we see as the benefits. The first one is the fact that, as I mentioned previously, S/4HANA is built entirely on the SAP HANA platform. HANA, it's an in-memory, highly performant platform which inherently gives you the ability to run transactions and reporting at a significantly increased speed, like doing complex calculations and analysis. But moreover, one of the key things that it provides is the ability to combine both transactional processing which are processes that you typically run today in ECC, with analytical processing, which you typically run in BW. So all of a sudden you've got this convergence of the two different dimensions of processes sitting on one platform, and that in itself gives some significant benefits, both from an IT perspective, but more importantly from a business perspective, and I'll go through a few examples. The fourth bullet point under the pillar one is one I just wanted to talk about. This is the first time that SAP's provided a platform that enables you to run all the various other business suite systems off of one database instance. I'll talk about this shortly in a bit more detail, but to us this is a fairly significant IT infrastructure savings play that S/4HANA can bring. The second point, the second pillar of S/4HANA is this whole concept of a simplified data model. So what fundamentally SAP has done is simplified the underlying table structures and data model that are required to run the business processes. Now, you can look at that as well, that's great. It reduces the overall amount of data that I need to store in the system, which is true. But more importantly, from a business perspective, if the underlying tables and data model is significantly simplified, well then, in theory, so are the business processes and the reports that sit on top of that. And that is precisely some of the examples that we'll walk you through of how having a simplified data model is more than just having less tables and less data to store. It's more about what does it mean to the overall business process and reporting. The third pillar is the fact that with S/4HANA, SAP's introduced a whole suite of new innovations, so new functionality, new modules, call it what you will. It's new processes or capability that only exist with S/4HANA because it's primarily capitalizing and leveraging the inherent capabilities of the SAP HANA platform and the simplified data model that S/4HANA provides. And we'll go through a few examples in the subsequent slides and what we see as the benefits. And last but not least, the fourth major pillar is this whole FIORI UX paradigm, a significant shift in the user experience design and paradigm that SAP has introduced via FIORI, which not only, in our opinion, not only improves the user experience and provides a consistent, easy-to-use set of role-based applications, but also enables some productivity benefits in ensuring transactional processes or end-to-end processes can be done in a much more efficient and timely manner. And I'll go through a few examples of where we see some benefits in that space. So that's kind of the overview of the four pillars. What I want to talk shortly about is a few examples for each of these. So for pillar one, the SAP HANA platform, we talked earlier on the early slide, the bit about convergence of transactional and analytical processing. So if you look at today's world on the left-hand side, you're in day-to-day transactions within your ERP system, whether that's posting an invoice or running a depreciation run, or perhaps executing MRP. But the reality is the results of those transactions are then typically extracted and loaded into your BW system for subsequent analytical processing. Now, there are challenges with that architecture. Everything from you've got redundancy in data, so data needs to be synchronized and replicated from one system to the other, and with that, reconciliation and error resolution issues. But moreover, from a business perspective, there is a lag, there is a latency in the overall cycle time to get from your transactions running on one system to being able to report and analyze what's actually happening in your organization. Which is precisely why with the SAP HANA platform, one of the things it provides on the right-hand side is the ability to combine both your transactional processing as well as your analytical processing in one. So no more requirements of replicating data from one to the other. You can run reports or calculations on the fly directly using your transactional data in the S/4HANA system. You've now got one single source of system, and more importantly, it starts giving you more timely insight into the performance of your organization, being able to identify issues, bottlenecks, and more importantly, coming up with the actions to resolve those. Now, from a business perspective, we've given a few examples of where we see this particular concept being of benefit. So if you look at finance, companies who have intensive cash management, liquidity processes, whether you're in financial services or large multinationals. Being able to run real-time, timely liquidity positions or cash management and forecast, it's substantial benefits, because not only does it give you a position, but more importantly, it identifies any future shortages or issues that you need to resolve by making the appropriate provisions. Today, organizations typically do that on an overnight basis, sometimes over the weekend, depending on the amount of data that's required to be processed. We see this as an area that potentially could be groundbreaking for some organizations where liquidity is of paramount importance. Another example is profitability analysis. For organizations that have implemented COPA, which is SAP's module for profitability analysis, typically there is an enormous amount of data and dimensions that are required to process and analyze to eventually generate profitability reporting. So with SAP's new profitability analysis functionality and the underlying SAP platform itself, you're now able to run this on a more timely basis and immediately see how well you're performing by customer segment, by marketing segment, or any other dimension that you so choose. On the flip side, for supply chain, MRP, a fairly intensive process in most organizations, you now have the ability to run the MRP as well as do reporting and issue resolution, identify inventory shortages on a more timely basis, as well as identify any slow-moving or dead stock and deal with that accordingly. So look, at the end of the day, these are some specific examples that we're seeing as beneficial to some organizations. At the end of the day, the intention of this slide is to start getting you to think about what does this mean for your organization, and are there any other scenarios that could be applicable to you which would give substantial benefits. The second benefit around the SAP HANA platform is the bit about enabling SAP landscape simplification. So if you look at the left-hand side, in today's world, typically, no more than just ERP, they'll have some organizations will have BPC, SRM, the previous version of the business suite. Each of those have databases. Moreover, every organization's got anywhere between 3 to 5 tiered landscape. You've got a development landscape, you've got QA, you've got pre-production, you've got production. So there is an immense number of database systems and infrastructure out there which need to be maintained, and with that come a level of cost. But just as importantly, from a business perspective, the more databases you have, the more data redundancy and data synchronization requirements you have, which ultimately lead to reconciliation and a lot of non-value-adding activities to make sure that these systems are synchronized. What SAP HANA provides, which is on the right-hand side, is for the first time the ability to consolidate a lot of these databases onto a single SAP HANA platform. So not only do you have kind of this whole concept of a single source of truth, but you've got a fairly simplified IT landscape, particularly when you then consider this needs to be done over each tier of the landscape: development, QA, pre-production, production. So for some organizations, this could be a substantial IT savings. But also from a business perspective, the simpler your IT landscape is, the simpler the data and the processes and the reports that the business need will become. So this is kind of a dual play potential benefit driver. So for the second pillar, the simplified data model, we've given an example here of how this kind of manifests itself, particularly for finance. So in the old world, on the left-hand side, you've got your finance processes and tables, and you've got your CO, your controlling module, processes and tables. And in between sit a whole bunch of aggregate tables and indices, which quite frankly do nothing other than aggregate the data or make it easier to kind of search and assess and analyze. And the only reason why they were introduced at the time was because of the hardware and technology constraints that prevented people from accessing and analyzing the underlying source tables, the financial documents. But in today's S/4HANA world, using the simplified data model, there is no longer a need for those aggregate and indice tables that sit in between. So that's the first benefit. So you've got less tables to worry about and less processes, which make the overall landscape simpler. But more importantly, what SAP has done, particularly for finance, is they have now they've come up with this concept of a universal journal where one financial document will now contain all the information that was previously needed for both finance and controlling, wrapped up into a single document, posted into a single table. And that table is called AC.A, which you may or may not have heard of. But this is a significant improvement in the way finance works, because by having all the information in one table, it now makes your overall business processes simpler. So what used to happen in the old world is you had a set of processes in finance and a set of processes in controlling. With the introduction of the universal journal and this single table, a lot of those processes have now been consolidated into one. So there is a business efficiency and simplicity on the processes that need to be done in finance. Very similarly, the same has been done for supply chain, particularly in the inventory space, where they've simplified the data model for inventory management, as well as the sales space. But the reality is, for supply chain, there will be more and more simplifications in future releases of S/4HANA Enterprise. The third pillar, the new innovations, we've listed here what we see as some of the key innovations that S/4HANA provides. I won't go through all of them, but I do want to talk about two of them specifically. The first one is around embedded business warehouse. So as we've talked about previously, you've now got the ability within your S/4HANA instance to have an embedded BW system, which can access your data, your actuals data, directly from the systems without having to necessarily persist it in a set of cubes, which in itself introduces some redundancy and synchronization issues. So you get all the benefits of what BW previously provided, but housed within the single S/4HANA instance. So you can do all the calculations that you've currently got, all the reporting on the fly, without having to introduce a standalone, substantially separate BW system. Now, I do want to make a note. This doesn't necessarily mean for every organization you can get rid of your BW systems, because that is absolutely not the case. There needs to be a due diligence that's done for every customer, but we do see some examples of where a lot of the processing that you do today in a standalone BW doesn't actually have to be done in a standalone. There's no reason why it cannot be done in an embedded fashion within S/4HANA. The second example in finance is around this concept of integrated business planning. So what SAP has done, very similar to BW, is they've introduced embedded BPC within S/4HANA. So you can now run directly your planning process directly on the S/4HANA actuals data. You don't need a separate installation for BPC. You've got real-time access to actuals, as well as master data from the tables, which then enable you to do real-time modeling and variance analysis, which ultimately reduces the overall planning cycle and enables you to do what-if and simulation exercises. Now, this is quite a substantial benefit depending on what planning processes you have in place today. But the reality is, if you are contemplating implementing a planning solution, this already comes bundled together with S/4HANA. There is no need to introduce yet another system. There is very much plans in place from SAP to also embed the consolidation functionality of BPC within S/4HANA. That doesn't exist yet, but it is in the roadmap to be introduced in near future releases. And by doing that, it just basically gives you an idea that the entire BPC suite will be embedded within S/4HANA in the future. The fourth pillar, FIORI. So this is, as mentioned, this is a fundamentally different method in terms of how the user experience paradigm works with S/4HANA. I mean, in the old ECC, ERP world, it was very much based on functionally based applications. The set of screens, for all intents and purposes, could be quite daunting, quite complex, lots of fields to fill in, multiple screens to traverse through. In some cases, the user interface would vary from one screen to the other depending on which application you were using. Where SAP's kind of vision for the user experience is on the right-hand side, which is all about smaller modular role-based apps. So they've decomposed the end-to-end process into these concepts of apps, which are a lot easier to use, a lot less fields to populate, easier access to all the information that you need, and more importantly, a consistent user experience, look and feel for all of these apps. Some of the examples that we've shown, or you may have seen, is they've redesigned and redeveloped about 100 plus SAP transactions that used to reside in SAP GUI and now been redeveloped into FIORI-based applications. So, it's great that this provides a significantly improved user experience, but one of the other benefits it also provides is increased productivity. SAP had recently undertaken an exercise whereby they had compared the amount of time required to run transactions using SAP GUI versus the amount of time to execute similar transactions using FIORI. And unsurprisingly, I mean, the benefits and the amount of time and effort required to complete the transactions are substantially reduced with FIORI. Not just because they're easier to use, but there are less number of screens that need to be traversed, less number of clicks, less number of fields that need to be populated, which ultimately makes the overall process a lot more efficient. So one of the areas that we encourage, and we'll talk about shortly, is not just to look at FIORI apps in isolation, but look at it as an end-to-end process. Does the introduction of FIORI make existing highly labor-intensive processes a lot more efficient by having an improved user experience? And in our opinion, there are certainly examples of some of that, which we'll talk about. So that's kind of an overview of the solution pillars. I just want to spend a few minutes around the migration options. I mean, there are currently, as an established SAP user, there are 3 options that can be considered on your journey to S/4HANA. And the reason why there are 3, I think you have to recognize that S/4HANA has been an evolving product, right? So it started off with Suite on HANA, which I'll talk about. It then introduced S/4HANA Finance, which was previously called Simplified, and now it's introduced S/4HANA Enterprise. So there are 3 options to consider on your journey. Now, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There are pros and cons with each of these options, which we've articulated in the next slide. But I just want to spend a couple of minutes on what these options are. Option 1 is migrating to Suite on HANA, which you may or may not have heard. But this is nothing more than running your classic ERP functionality on a HANA database. So it was initially released in 2013. It's been around for quite some time. But what this provides are all the inherent benefits of the SAP HANA platform, both in terms of speed and accuracy, of complex calculations and reporting, removal of batch jobs. I mean, these are all the benefits that Suite on HANA provides. What it doesn't provide is that all the data model simplifications and innovations that S/4HANA has introduced are not available within Suite on HANA, and nor is the intention to introduce them on Suite on HANA. So this is kind of, think of this as an interim step on your journey to S/4HANA that could warrant some serious consideration. The second option, which is an increment to option 1, is to implement S/4HANA Finance, which was previously called Simplified. This was introduced late 2014, and what it is it's the simplification and new innovations for finance only. So you get all the benefits of the S/4HANA solution suite and all the pillars I've talked about, but only for finance. So the remaining logistics, whether it's supply chain or production planning or whatever have you, that still remains on the classic ERP functionality with the classic data model, and nothing's really happened in that space. But this is a fairly mature version. It's going on to version 3 in May 2016. And last but not least, option 3, which is the option that was introduced in November of last year. It's S/4HANA Enterprise. So this is the first release of a simplified ERP model. So it's not just finance, it's finance and a subset of logistics. So with this slide, just repeating myself for those of you who didn't hear, what we've done is a comparative analysis of the 3 options that we presented on the previous slide. And for each of these 3 options, we've done a pros and cons analysis across 4 different dimensions. We've looked at it across maturity. How mature is this product or this option in terms of number of customers that are using it, or the number of years that this solution's been on the market. We've also done a comparative analysis across the strategic alignment of the solution. How well aligned is it to SAP's vision? And then the third and fourth dimensions are all around comparative analysis across what we see as the scale of the benefits and the total cost of each of those options. So again, as mentioned, we encourage you to review this slide at your own leisure, but hopefully it'll give you a bit of an appreciation on some of the things to consider in your evaluation. Okay, so the next slides are primarily around what do we see as the key value enablers to building a compelling business case for S/4HANA. So the approach that we've adopted in helping customers really revolve around 5 different value enablers. It's around simplification, and by that we mean not just simplification of the IT landscape, but also simplification of the business processes and reporting as a result of using the HANA platform and the simplified data model. The second value enabler is the speed and agility, is looking at what does it mean to be able to run complex calculations and analysis on a more timely basis. What does that specifically mean to your organization, and what are some of the business benefits or IT benefits that can result from that? The third is all around analytics and reporting. In our view, there's quite a bit of simplification that could be done in this space, which manifests itself as a benefit to both IT as well as the business. And then productivity and cross-functional transparency are the 5. For each of these, I'll walk you through a few examples of use cases or areas that we would encourage you to explore the value creation of S/4HANA. But I think the key thing I want to say here is, no one knows your business better than yourselves. So whilst we talk about the value enablers here, I think it's absolutely important for you to think about these in the context of your own environment, your own organization, your own industry, and your own processes. Because I think the more meaningful you make this, the more compelling the business case it gets. So simplification, this is reducing the IT landscape as well as reducing some of the business processes. In terms of value identification, we're very much focused on, from an IT perspective, one of the things you need to assess is look at the potential IT infrastructure savings, particularly on the database side, by consolidating the various SAP systems, whether it's BW, BPC, SRM, onto a single SAP HANA platform. There are also some significant BW simplification savings by moving a lot of your operational reports, which exists in BW, directly into S/4HANA, because there is no longer a need to be performing that in a separate system. You can potentially look at embedding BPC using integrated business planning, or embedded BW for that matter, which will have IT as well as business benefits. So the use cases here, I think I've talked about most of them, but there are also some business benefits. The third bullet point down, as a result of implementing S/4HANA, particularly in the finance space, as I mentioned, a lot of the business processes that exist within finance and controlling have now been merged into a single set of business processes. So by definition, the number of people required to run these processes should be substantially less than what they are today, not just from a transactional processes, but also from a reporting perspective as well. Everything from reconciliations to running various FI and CO processes needs to be taken into consideration. The speed and agility. Now, one of the things we would suggest you look at is what are the long-running batch jobs that you have today in your environment, and what are the dependent processes that are waiting for those batch jobs to complete. And if you look at those as an end-to-end process, and then start thinking about, well, if these were to be executed on a much more efficient, timely basis, what does that actually mean for me as a business? Does that mean I can then do some more informed decision-making? Does it mean I can identify some potential issues or faults on a more timely basis? Can I potentially do some preventative and or predictive analysis to start looking at some future simulation exercises? We've given a few use cases of long-running transaction examples. that we would encourage you to start assessing, whether that's MRP or running some heavy finance transactional processes. Value enabler number 3, analytics and reporting. I think we've probably talked about this in quite some depth. There is definitely an opportunity to look at your entire reporting suite and your reporting landscape and start identifying how best can you rationalize and or consolidate your reports into a much more efficient architecture. And whether that's developing those reports or migrating them directly onto S/4HANA, or whether that's using embedded BW within HANA to implement those reports, or quite frankly, in some cases, it's removing the reports because they are no longer required. A lot of the reports that may have been generated today, that you're using today, have been implemented because the underlying table structure and data model has been quite complex. Going forward, if you now have a more simpler table structure to report off of, you no longer need a lot of those reports. So your reporting hierarchy and your reporting structures are substantially simplified. The fourth value enabled, productivity. So again, look at highly labor-intensive transactions, end-to-end processes, and start asking yourself around if you were to implement or introduce the FIORI-based user experience diagram that we talked about. How much of a benefit to the user experience and the productivity could that labor-intensive process actually achieve? And what does that mean for me as an organization? So we've been a few there in terms of reduction in the overall planning cycle, accelerated month-end closing, the ability to do soft close versus hard close. And there are lots of other examples from an MRP perspective in the supply chain space. And lastly, cross-functional transparency. I mean, one of the things you can do with FIORI is enable users to have access to data across a multitude of SAP systems, not just within ERP itself, but you can have access to data within CRM, within SRM, then SCM. You now have the capability of developing your own FIORI apps that integrate all of these business processes and data into a single, easy-to-use user interface. And SAP has actually introduced quite a few innovations in this space in the context of cockpits, where you can monitor the end-to-end, for example, the end-to-end order-to-fulfillment process across a multitude of systems, from CRM, looking at the customer calls, to the production planning of how well is my order progressing based on my committed delivery date. And this is primarily the power of what FIORI provides. So hopefully that should kind of give you an appreciation of the key things that we would recommend you look out for in assessing S/4HANA and building a compelling business case. I'd like to just kind of end this with a couple of slides around, we fully recognize that the challenge organizations like yourselves have is, as mentioned, is how do I build that business case? Is this compelling for my organization? And if so, when is it compelling? And that's not an easy answer, and it'll differ from organization to organization. But certainly what we've developed is this whole concept of a agile benefits creation methodology, which is entirely based on a benefits-driven realization approach using agile methodology. And what we provide is the ability to work with you on two fronts. One is we provide you with a service to help you assess the fit of S/4HANA, develop that compelling business case using the value enablers that we've just talked about, as well as then put together a roadmap that makes sense for your organization. The second service, obviously, is having made that decision, we can then help you execute and deliver the migration onto S/4HANA using our 1, 2, 3, our 3-step process, which we've outlined here. The only leaving message I'd like to kind of part you with is, this is a journey at the end of the day. And where this journey starts, from our perspective, as part of this methodology, is a free workshop. So we are offering, as part of our ABC 1, 2, 3 approach, we are offering a free 1-day workshop to provide you with a more in-depth overview of S/4HANA, as well as in the afternoon have some breakout sessions with the respective areas of your organization within finance, logistics, within IT, to start brainstorming some high-level scenarios in line with the 5 value enablers that we talked about that could make sense for your organization. And at least at the end of that 1-day workshop, it gives you an appreciation of whether S/4HANA is something that you see yourselves as an early adopter or potentially a fast follower. So we encourage you to take us up on this offer. It's certainly something that we are actively doing across all of our customer base, and we've got some very good feedback from our customers on that front. So in conclusion, before I go into the question session, it's hopefully the webinar and what we've presented gives you a clear idea that look, S/4HANA is SAP's future. It is the future, and if you want to take advantage of the newest innovations, the question for a lot of organizations is a question of when, not if, to migrate. But the key thing, which I've hopefully made clear, is there isn't a one-size-fits-all. The S/4HANA benefits case and the migration roadmap will differ from one organization to the other. But what we do encourage is start the S/4HANA discussion early. Understand the new capabilities of S/4HANA. Understand what are the benefit drivers and the deployment options that are most applicable to your organization, because only you know your organization as well as you do. We do recommend creating an S/4HANA roadmap, so at least it kind of gives you the vision of where you see S/4HANA sitting within your overall application strategy, and what are the immediate as well as longer-term impact and potential benefits. There are demo environments available for S/4HANA. There's an SAP Cloud version. We ourselves have got a specific pre-configured version as well that we're happy to show you. But I think the key thing is if you are interested, we would encourage you to take us up on the free one-day S/4HANA overview workshop. So with that said, we have a few minutes left over for our Q&A session. Over to you, Gaurav.
Thank you very much, Ed. We will now begin the question and answer session for all participants. I will request all the participants to key in their questions in the Q&A dialog box only. Due to paucity of time, we will be able to answer only a limited set of questions. However, the remaining ones would be taken up later through an email on a one-to-one basis. Can we have the questions now?
Here we go. So we've got a few questions coming in. So I'll just read out the questions and I'll answer. The first question is all around, can you give us a bit of information around the license pricing for S4? So, I mean, the license pricing for S4HANA really depends on which version you go with. As I mentioned, there are two versions. There's an on-premise version and then there's a cloud edition. So the on-premise, let me focus on that because that's where most of the interest is. It's very similar to the license pricing model that you have today with ECC. It's based on named user licenses. Depending on the type of users, you have professional users, you have employee self-service users. And then you've got a database license, a HANA database license pricing, which typically is, I think, 15% or 8% of the overall software application value. So it's very similar to the model that you have today. The Cloud Edition, on the other hand, it is a subscription-based pricing model, which is a fixed amount per user per annum based on the scope of functionality that's been implemented. Okay, so the next question is, what is the impact to the custom code when migrating to SAP? I mean, that's a good question. So what SAP has done to make the migration as non-disruptive as possible is they've introduced this concept of compatibility views. So recognizing that a lot of the tables no longer exist in the simplified data model, that may have an impact on some of your custom code. What SAP has done is they've introduced this concept of compatibility views, so the tables are still there on a virtual sense, but what they do is they're redirected to the new set of tables that S4HANA has provided. So as long as your custom code is doing any reading from tables, then a lot of the custom code should not be impacted when you migrate it to the new S4HANA data model. However, if your custom code is doing writing to, let's say, some custom additional fields that you may have appended onto a custom table, then there could very well be some redevelopment that you need to undertake as part of the migration. And this is precisely one of the things that we do in our ABC 123 approach. Is we have some tool sets, as does SAP, where we can run these tool sets on your existing landscape and immediately identify what are all the custom codes, programs that will be impacted by a migration to S/4HANA, and what do we feel is the complexity of the changes required. And in some cases, for some custom code, the answer is going to be none. It's a read-only custom code. Using compatibility views, there shouldn't be an issue. And in some cases, it might be a case of, all right, well, you need to probably redesign, redevelop certain portions of it. There is also the other aspect, which is just because a custom code, when you migrate it, in some scenarios, it may not need any changes. But there could be some scenarios where if you want to make better use of the performance enhancements that HANA provides, that it could be in your best interest to redevelop some of that custom code to directly call the underlying S/4HANA tables, and thereby it's a lot more efficient, a lot quicker. And really, this comes down to a case-to-case basis, which we're happy to talk about in a bit more depth. So we have a question on what is the roadmap of SCM, so this is supply chain management, being fully implemented into S/4HANA? I think that's a good question, and the honest answer is it's not entirely clear. So there are certainly examples of where certain functionality will be incorporated into S/4HANA. So uh, PPDS, S4 will fit within S/4HANA. I'm talking about the fact that APO will eventually be migrated into planning, integrated business planning, which I've talked about shortly. But at this stage, it's in terms of timelines, there isn't anything concrete in the roadmap. Who is the contact for the S/4HANA presentation? I think on the last slide that we present, I provide my email address. So anyone interested in the one-day workshop, you can just shoot me an email, and we'd be more than happy to organize that. The presentation material will be provided, as well as the recorded session of this webinar will be provided at the very end. So the question is, how do existing licenses and arrangements get impacted by S/4HANA for both on-premise and the cloud? It's a good question. So I think this is on a case-by-case. It depends on what you've got and what you need as part of your migration. But I can tell you right now that as part of the migration, SAP does, it's not a case of you need to throw everything out the window and start all over again. There are definitely some things that SAP does to make the migration a lot easier. But at the end of the day, the way the license model works for the on-premise version is very similar to the way it works for ERP today. It's all about number of users that are requiring access to the system, and how much of the system do they require access to? Are they a professional user or are they a self-service user? And it's all about the HANA database, which is 15% of the overall software application value. So I think we're out of time. Thank you for the questions. More than happy to answer more questions on a one-to-one basis. Gaurav, can I hand it back to you, please, to close the webinar?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Ed, for this thoroughly engaging session. For any further questions, please feel free to get in touch with us at the email ID being displayed on the screen. Last but not the least, I would like to thank you all for being a part of this webinar. Hope the webinar was insightful. Catch you soon. Cheers.